Ladies and gentlemen, this episode we are going to be looking at the election of John Adams and the John Adams presidency. So far, we've looked at George Washington, our first president, and we learned in that section where there was a lot of controversy that developed between John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, just to name a few, over what direction the government should take. So in the election of 1796, George Washington sets a precedent. That is, he's the first to do something. And he decides he is not going to run for a third term. He feels like that in a democracy, power should be shared by a majority of the people. And he feels like 2 terms as president was enough. And so he is going to effectively step down as president. Now, remember, this is a very unusual thing. Up to this point, most leaders had power for life. If you think about a king or an emperor, something like that, these people had power until they died. So Washington voluntarily giving up power was a revolution in and of itself. But this paves the way for his vice president, John Adams, to run for his own term as president. Now, this was something that John Adams really wanted. He had been serving as Washington's vice president for 8 years. He was incredibly well known in the colonies, or in now the country now, I should say, not the colonies. But he was still one of those founding fathers that everybody knew about. So in 1796, he's running for president. He's going to run against his primary opponent, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Adams had once been very, very close friends. They had corresponded for years. It was Adams that brought Jefferson into the Committee of Five to help write the Declaration of Independence, or actually to write the Declaration of Independence, I should say. And they had remained very close, but now they are split by differences in how the government should work. And so we now have 2 old friends who are now rivals. They are opponents. And this turns into a bitter election. These guys are going at each other. They are, they're talking a lot of smack about each other, to be quite honest. And it turns into a fiasco of epic proportions in many ways. And under the idea of, let me slide me over here real quick. Under the idea of how the Constitution was originally set up, the president would be the guy who wins the most electoral votes, and the vice president would be the man who won the second most. They did not foresee the rise of these political parties. And so Adams wins the majority, and Jefferson wins the second spot. So now we have 2 men who are rivals. One is president, one is vice president. So this really is, it's a disaster of epic proportions. Let's be quite honest. We have these 2 guys who are fundamentally opposed to each other and how the government should work. One is president, one is vice president. So to put that in modern terms, this would be like Biden being elected president and Trump being the vice president from our past election. So can you only imagine the bitter dispute that's going to go on between these men? There's a lot of controversy built into this. And of course, what really happens is that the 4 years under Adams, we really have Jefferson working at every turn to build up his reputation so he can run again in 1800. And Adams trying everything he can do to keep Jefferson from gaining as many votes as possible for the election of 1800. So it's really a very bitter time for the country. So if you think elections are bad now, go back to 1796, go back to 1800. Those elections were very bitter. They were very into mudslinging. They called each other names. They made accusations against each other that were pretty well unfounded, and in some cases very well founded, but they were very bitter. So keep that in mind. Now, there are 2 big, real defining moments for the Adams presidency, as we're going to look at in this class. The first is the XYZ affair. And just to sum it up really succinctly and very briefly, it's a bribe. Okay. We are sending people to France to negotiate the easing of tensions between America and France. And French officials basically meet with the Americans and say, before you even come into the negotiating table, you have to pay us bribe money. And this really infuriates the American delegation. And once that becomes known back in America, it infuriates America as well. And so Adams, who does not want war, he realizes that going to war would actually really hurt America. Remember, we're only, at this point, we're 10, 12 years old as a nation. We are not that far along, removed from being under the control of the British. And the French are supposed to be our allies for perpetuality. And that means forever. And it's not going well. So he's really distrustful of this. His own party begins to turn against him, saying, hey, we should go to war with the French now because they are asking for bribe money. But Adams stays the course. He refuses to pay the bribe money, and he sends new negotiators. It ends in peace. But really, what the XYZ affair is, it's about a bribe. But the real important thing, in my opinion, is that Adams prevents America from going to war, realizing that America is not prepared for a war. There's just no way we can afford it, number one. And number two, we don't have the manpower. We don't have the strength. We don't have the necessary army. We don't have the tools to go to war at this time. The other defining moment of Adams' presidency is the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, when I say alien, stop thinking UFOs, stop thinking that. Alien simply means someone from another country here in America or in another country illegally. And so an alien could be anyone who came to America without going through the proper channels, so to speak. And again, it has to do with our supposed allies, the French. Now, you have to go back to that difference between Adams and Jefferson a little bit, because as you might remember, Jefferson was very pro-French. He thought we should move away from dealings with Britain. And Adams, as a Federalist, is more, we need to have closer ties to Britain because they have the things we need to be successful. They have manufacturing and they have goods that we need. The French can't offer us that. And so we have this difference of opinion. And keep in mind, this is the era of the Napoleonic Wars. France and England are fighting, and we don't want any part of that. That's part of that XYZ affair piece. We want to retain a policy of neutrality. And so we want to not take sides as much as possible here. And there is this big movement against illegal aliens, against people here without our permission. We feel they could be acting as spies, perhaps. And so the Alien Act extended residency for immigrants to become citizens. So you have to live in America for a certain number of years before you could become an American citizen. True now as it was back then. But the Alien Act back then was you live here for 5 years, you can become an American citizen. So under the Alien Act, this extends that period of time to 14 years. And what that does, very, very coincidentally, wink, wink, is that to be a citizen comes with the rights of being a citizen. That is, you have the right to vote. So you think about the French, you think about the sympathizers for the French people coming here, wanting to vote. Who are they going to vote for? Adams? Or are they going to vote for Jefferson? They're voting for Jefferson. He is the man who wants to remain close to France. Does Adams want that to happen? And the answer, of course, is no. He does not want Jefferson to gain those possible votes. So by extending the years that immigrants have to remain in America to become citizens, what he's actually doing is denying them the right to vote, denying Jefferson political power. So this is kind of a sneaky, underhanded way of playing politics. The Sedition Acts, and there were a couple of them, and I'm going to move myself to the other side here real quick. The Sedition Acts also made it legal, if you want to say that, to deport immigrants in the U.S. from a warring country. So if there was someone here who was from France, we could swoop in and say, okay, you're French, you're going back to France. We don't care what you've said, what you've done, we can get rid of you. Likewise, we could with the British, but remember, this is Adams' policy against people who are going to give Jefferson power. And so it's mainly aimed at the French. And the final Sedition Act restricts the freedom of speech. It is a blow, if you will, to the First Amendment. Basically, it said you could not criticize the Adams presidency, and you could not criticize John Adams. It said nothing about criticizing Thomas Jefferson. You can still do that. You cannot criticize the Federalist government that was in power, and you could not criticize John Adams himself. If you were found guilty of this, you could be thrown in jail. And in some cases, that is exactly what happened. And so this is a restriction on freedom of speech, that First Amendment right. Now, of course, the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson are going to scream and yell and say, hey, this is totally illegal. This goes against freedom of speech set forth in the Bill of Rights, that First Amendment to the Constitution. This is a huge problem. And so, as you can imagine, Adams, he had a little popularity coming off XYZ, but the Alien Sedition Acts will really crimp Adams' chances of becoming president in 1800. So let's look at that election of 1800 very quickly. And we're going to see, I'm going to move myself again to this side, we're going to see that all that posturing between the Federalist Adams and the Democratic Republican of Jefferson is that the election is going to be even more bitter than that of 1796. There is an incredible amount of negative campaigning going on between these two men. Remember, these guys used to be friends. And think about it, who can hurt you more, a stranger or a friend? And I think some of you, or most of you, have realized by this point in your life, the friend can always hurt you more. And these guys are out for blood. And Alien and Sedition Acts really puts a nail in Adams' coffin. He loses re-election, and Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, becomes president. Now, what this does do, this election really urges Congress to pass the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, where the president and vice president run together. So we'd have no more first place, second place votes become president and vice president. We're not splitting the votes. This keeps those two different political parties from being president and vice president at the same time. Now it is president and vice president run together on one ticket, so to speak, and get the votes. So there's no more splitting up of political parties here. So that's a really important piece. The election of 1800 was not clean. It actually had to go to the House of Representatives to be decided because the electoral votes were tied between Jefferson and Adams. And remember back, I said that Adams' party itself had split. So this is where that's going to come back to haunt him, because Alexander Hamilton, who had served as Secretary of Treasury under Washington, he is going to throw his influence, and he had a lot of influence, to Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Even though Hamilton is a Federalist, he does not believe that Adams is suited for the presidency, and throws his influence to Jefferson. The House votes in Jefferson's favor. Jefferson wins, and Adams is out. Now, wanting to preserve Federalist power as much as possible, Adams does something that had not been done under Washington, because Washington didn't feel the need to do this. But he is going to appoint many new judges, 42 or 43 judges, I believe, just days, hours even before leaving office. So in this way, remember, who interprets the law? It's the judicial branch. So what Adams is hoping is, by appointing Federalists as these new judges, that they would have the power to overturn or limit what Jefferson could do as president. So he's appointing these Federalist people as judges, even up to hours before he actually left office. These are called the midnight appointments, and this is the third of three reasons why Adams' presidency is very notable. These midnight appointments were signed by Adams. They were sealed by the Secretary of State, and they were supposed to be delivered by the Secretary of State. Unfortunately, time ran out, and some of those commissions, those powers authorizing these men to become judges, were not delivered. And ultimately, they were supposed to be delivered under the new Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson, but Jefferson orders them not to be delivered because the last thing he wants is for more Federalists to be in power. And so he is going to order them to be left invalid, so they cannot take office. And so some of the some of those Federalist judges begin to criticize and to complain about, hey, we want our judgeships. We want our jobs that have been promised to us. And one of those things was a guy by the name of Marbury. And he is going to bring suit against the new Secretary of State, James Madison, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court. The case is called Marbury versus Madison. And this is actually a very important Supreme Court case. It's argued whether he should or should not be a judge. It is found that he should be named a judge. Marbury should be delivered his commission. He should be a judge. That would be perfectly legal. But the Supreme Court also says, here's the problem. This is not our job to determine this. This should have started in a different court. This is called the Court of Jurisdiction, where court cases should be tried. And so what this really does is it establishes the Supreme Court's power of judicial review. We've talked about judicial review before, but this is the first time it's really been put in practice in 12 years of presidency. That's 8 years under Washington, 4 years under Adams. Actually, it's about 16 years because it's about 1802 when this case finally goes to the Supreme Court. So for the very first time, the Supreme Court has taken a stand and saying, we have the power to look at laws and say what is constitutional, what is right under the Constitution, and what is not. And so the Supreme Court is making itself the equal of the other three branches by declaring itself to have this power. They have the final say on what the law is and what the Constitution means. And so this really made the judicial branch the equal of the other two. Before, nobody really thought much about the judicial branch. It was nice to be appointed to the Supreme Court, but they were rotating in and out, left and right. It wasn't a huge deal. All the power seemed to be with the president or with Congress. Now the Supreme Court's saying we have the same power they do. So Adams, very influential even to the end, even though it's unintended. That's kind of the way it's going to work out for Adams. He's going to have a lot of unintended consequences on the country. He is the first president to serve only one term. In fact, the next couple of presidents will all serve 2 terms. In fact, the next person to only serve one term as president will be Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, who will also only serve one term. So kind of the curse of the Adams here. And part of that has to do with their character. They are very brilliant men, but they are very easy to dislike. They're very grouchy. They're very angry. They think they are right. Everyone else is wrong. And they really are very short-sighted in that character trait, the Adams men. The other thing about Adams I think is really important, just to add in here very quickly. Even though he lost the election of 1800, he still resigned power to an opposing party. Now, let me rephrase that. At no time in history has transition between 2 different powers gone very smoothly. In fact, it usually results in one being either exiled or executed, or there's a rebellion. And in this particular case, Adams is voted out of office. He's not happy. He puts in place some judges to try to preserve the Federalist idea of how government should work. But when the time comes, he's out the door. He voluntarily walks out. No one has to force him. And so power transitions from opposing parties without a shot being fired. And I think that's a really important piece. I think it also says a lot about Adams, that even though he and Jefferson hate each other at this point, and even though they're very opposing ideologies politically, and even though they've both been hurt deeply in this presidential election by mudslinging and everything else, he still understands the idea of what democracy in America should look like. And yes, he realizes for it to work, he has to step down. He has to walk away. And he does. So kudos to Adams for realizing that. And he really, I think in my case, in my mind, he really preserves the idea of democracy for many, many years to come. So I think that's it on John Adams. We're going to end right there. Make sure you check those questions in the reading guide. Make sure everything lines up. If you have questions, be sure to ask. Thank you, and everybody have a wonderful day.